webinar series. Today's session is hosted by myself, Kobe Hayes, and Fakiza Rajab. And today, Fakiza will be taking us through using the prospect screener in high volume context. Over to you, Fakiza.
Thank you, Kobe. So in today's hour, or slightly less than that, webinar, like Kobe mentioned, we're going to be looking at the prospect screener and how it's used in high volume context. So covered in our webinar today, we're first going to look at the personnel selection process. What does it entail? What is it all about? Then we're going to look specifically at the prospect screener. How does it work? How does it fit into the personnel selection process? Then we're going to look at interpreting reports from the prospect screener. Both individual reports and group reports will be considered. We're then going to look at how we can apply these results to our personnel selection process. Lastly, we're going to see the prospect screener as a supporting tool. Remember that this is not to be used in isolation, but rather other assessments need to be considered further down in the process after getting results from the prospect screener. So let's start with personnel selection. In 1970, Beach had said that the sourcing out or elimination of those judged unqualified to meet job and organization requirements is the reason that we engage in personnel selection. Looking at our more recent researchers, Carroll, Elbert, and Hatfield in 2002, they said that personnel selection is a selection, the process of choosing from a group of applicants the individual best suited for a particular position. If we look at Munchinsky and colleagues' 2004 model, where does the prospect screener fit into this? So if you look at the top, your candidates will apply for your advertised position. This starts off your personnel selection process. It's the important initial stage where your most promising individuals for selection are identified. After that, your interviews, psychometric assessments, reference checking, and other forms of assessments are initiated to determine which individuals are best suited to the job task. That is where the prospect screener comes in, as a screening assessment. This preliminary screening phase is usually composed of relatively cost-effective and easy-to-implement techniques to determine candidates' suitability for a job or position. Following that, we will then engage in background and reference checking, as well as interviews, biographical forms, in-baskets, and further in-depth assessments. Your other screening techniques would include these, and although many of these techniques are valid methods for screening out candidates based on the most salient job requirements, traditionally, however, they did not necessarily reveal psychological constructs that are assessed at a later phase in the selection process, nor were they considered strictly objective, reliable, or standardized for all selection contexts. The prospect screener then allows employees to get an indication of applicants' verbal, numerical, and detailed checking skills, as well as work style, in the form of emotional stability and dependability, helping you make a selection. If we look at the history of the prospect screener, this screening tool was first developed in 2012 and was released in 2013 by JvR Psychometrics, so it is a South African developed assessment. Was not intended to predict or explain ability or behavior in its own right, but rather to be used to determine if candidates are good prospects for further psychometric measurements based on their inherent ability and behavioral orientations. While many other screening tools do exist, which measure the basic skills, abilities, and knowledge of candidates to complete specific tasks or jobs effectively, no screening tool had yet existed at that point that measured basic psychological characteristics for screening purposes that had been developed at that point. There was a clear need for a screening tool that could identify prospective candidates with minimum capacities and characteristics to qualify for further testing and assessment. The prospect screener provides a preliminary screening of verbal and numerical ability, detail orientation, emotional stability, and dependability, which are widely considered important for effective job fit and performance. If we look at the purpose and the rationale behind the prospect screener, we'll see that the prime purpose of the prospect screener is to screen out candidates that do not meet the minimum standards for employability or job performance. As in-depth selection processes such as interviews, CV checking, and psychological assessment processes are expensive, labor-intensive, and time-consuming, it seems logical to have a way of screening candidates earlier to determine who does not have the minimum characteristics or capabilities to meet the job requirements. This significantly reduces the cost and time wasted in the selection process. The prospect screener allows large numbers of prospective employees to be assessed quickly and inexpensively. Candidates who are unlikely to perform effectively on more detailed, time-consuming, and expensive assessments, or who do not fit the job profile, are identified earlier in the process. Meanwhile, those candidates who do meet minimum requirements are classified as prospects for further assessment and consideration. The prospect screener, therefore, measures your basic entry level, numerical and verbal ability, detail orientation, and work styles, important predictors of job performance, which involves upward mobility, occupational attainment, job satisfaction, work perception, and supervisory style for most occupations. Your areas assessed have also been shown to be necessary for effective job fit and performance. If we then look at the prospect screener, it is broken down into 5 scales. It is an online assessment hosted by JvR Online and is geared towards mass screening projects for your high volume context. The assessment has a total of 62 multiple choice questions and takes approximately 15 to 30 minutes to complete. If we look at the assessment scales, there are 5 of them, starting with the words, which are 8 items. This measures your entry-level verbal ability. Candidates are asked to match standard words to a word option that most closely resembles the meaning of the standard or your synonyms in a multiple-choice format. Candidates with high scores can be considered minimally proficient in using and understanding English. Lower scores indicate that candidates likely find it difficult to understand English and are less proficient in their use of the language. Your second scale, your number scale of 10 items, measures entry-level numerical ability. Candidates are asked to work out numerical problems without a calculator, and then select the correct answer from 4 alternatives. These mathematical problems are simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, as well as a few BODMAS questions. Candidates with high scores display the ability to do mathematical calculations and are considered to have basic numerical skills. Candidates with low scores may be considered to be innumerate or unwilling to necessarily want to use numbers in their working space. Details, our third scale, that's 24 items, which measures your detail checking and accuracy ability. Candidates are presented with 2 sets of words and numbers and are asked whether the 2 sets are identical or not, by being asked to determine whether information in the copy column contains the same information as the original column. Candidates who score high on the scale can be seen to be able to perceive differences in stimuli, which facilitates accuracy when completing detail-oriented work. Candidates with lower scores may be seen to have less of an inclination to perceive differences in stimuli, and as a result may at times make careless mistakes. Our next scale is work styles of 20 items, which is broken down into emotional stability of 10 items and dependability also of 10 items. What this looks at is your candidate's behavioral orientation towards working environments. This scale measures whether the candidate is emotionally stable or not prone to anxiety, self-doubt, and fluctuation of mood, and dependable. Are they conscientious, rule-abiding, careful, and detail-conscious? So you have your emotional stability and dependability scales, which make up this work style, which measure characteristics of neuroticism and conscientiousness. Candidates are asked to indicate on a 5-point Likert scale to what degree they agree or disagree with statements relating to emotional stability or dependability. Neuroticism, which is your low levels of emotional stability, determines to what degree the candidate remains calm under pressure, how anxious the candidate is, and whether the candidate is likely or unlikely to vacillate between emotional extremes. Your conscientiousness, which is your high levels of dependability, measures the candidate's propensity for rule adherence, perfectionism, predictability, and risk aversion. High levels of emotional stability, or your lower levels of neuroticism and dependability, or your high levels of conscientiousness, are considered as an advantage for your most white-collar jobs. A scale measuring locus of control, or the perception that individuals have on the relationship between their own behavior and the results of reward or punishment, used to be part of this prospect screener research version, since that construct had also been shown to be an important requirement of white-collar jobs. However, the scale was removed after initial research into the psychometric properties. So our current version of the prospect screener has 5 scales: words, numbers, detail checking, emotional stability, and dependability, made up of 62 items in total. This tool may be used to assess individuals 18 years and older with the minimum English reading level or education level of grade 12. So, when should we be using the prospect screener? The prospect screener should be used in corporate settings of applicants to determine their suitability for further selection and consideration based on their ability and behavioral orientation. It may be used by a psychologist, a psychometrist, or any human resources practitioner. Therefore, it is not necessary to be HPCSA accredited when using the prospect screener. The prospect screener may not be used, however, as an educational, clinical, counseling, or correctional assessment. It may be used in research but not as a preventative measure. It may not be used as an intervention to predict ability or behavioral changes. It is a screening tool only, used to identify candidates who do not meet the minimum standards for employability or job performance. Its sole purpose is to determine whether candidates are good prospects for further psychometric measurements. It aims to be efficient at enhancing the selection process, allowing masses to be assessed quickly and inexpensively. If your candidate is unlikely to perform effectively on this assessment, they should be screened out and no further assessments should be conducted on them. If they do meet the minimum requirements, they are then seen as a prospect for further assessment and consideration. Also, because the process of administration and scoring of this assessment is automated on our JvR portal, no assessment-specific training is required. Therefore, you do not have to be a psychologist or psychometrist or registered with the HPCSA. If the assessment is done in hard copy or in your paper and pencil format, the assessment will still be captured on the online platform, meaning that the scoring and interpretation is still automated and thus can be used by an HR practitioner. The assessment is not used for abilities or behavioral characteristics, so it's not necessarily measuring psychological constructs. The assessment is only used to determine the candidate's suitability for further selection and consideration based on their ability and behavioral orientations. It is recommended for jobs that require entry-level verbal ability, numerical ability, detail consciousness, emotional stability, and dependability. It may also be used for large talent pools where there is doubt that the group has the rudimentary capacities to meet job demands. So how do we go about getting a report? Upon completing this assessment, be it online or hard copy, your individual report is generated on the JV Online portal. Your report provides results on all 5 scales, so your words, your numbers, your detail orientation, dependability, and emotional stability. You will also be provided with a result of your overall prospect, where you are categorized into screened out, your prospect, or good prospect. We will be looking at a report shortly and how to interpret this. It is critical that once again, this assessment process is holistic and your final selection decisions are made using a battery of multiple assessments and various sources of information from reliable data forms. The prospect screener is not to be used by itself, rather it's only the beginning of your battery. Okay. So some questions that I have been asked by practitioners wanting to use this assessment is, do I have to administer the assessment online? We have answered this a bit earlier, but no, you can administer this assessment in hard copy, and as long as you capture it on the JvR online portal, the scoring is done automatically. Therefore, a psychologist does not necessarily have to be involved in getting a report. Something else that I've been asked, how does the administration work in your high volume analysis? It will work the same way as you administer any other report, any other assessment. I mean, you can administer it to the whole group in a large setting, or you can administer it to your individuals and at a later stage come up with your group report. So a sample individual report, it's a very short report. As you can see, on the left-hand side is your cover page of the report, and on page 2 are the results of that individual. On the left, if you look at the right picture, on the left-hand side, you will see the names of each of the scales, so words, numbers, details, dependability, and emotional stability. You'll also see overall prospect. On top, you will see red for screened out, yellow for prospect, and green for good prospect. So, what does screened out mean? Screened out means that your candidate does not meet the minimum requirements on the scale to be considered for further assessment and selection. The candidate is therefore unlikely to meet the minimum required level to be effective in the position for which they are being selected. The candidate does not appear to be a good prospect for further selection. If we then look at the second one, prospect, this means that your candidate does meet the minimum requirements on the scale and should be considered a prospect for further assessment and selection. The candidate demonstrates a functional level of capacity to be effective in the position for which they have applied. The candidate could be considered for further selection processes. There's actually, there we go, we can look at it in a bit more detail. A good prospect is a candidate that should be considered for further assessment and selection. The candidate demonstrates the capacity to accomplish the minimum required competencies with relative effectiveness. The candidate is therefore a good prospect for further consideration. Your overall prospect scale should be consulted when making a decision when retaining or screening out candidates. The overall prospect scale summarizes the overall potential the candidate has for further assessment and selection and should be the first scale consulted and the only scale used to make pre-selection decisions. The other scales of the prospect screener are used to contextualize these results and should not be interpreted independently. So a question that a practitioner has asked me is, will the candidate then also be proposed for further steps in the process only when they are in the green or also when they are in the yellow? Well, that depends on how many candidates you have put through this process. If you are selecting for maybe 10 individuals and only 2 of them are sitting in the green, then yes, maybe you would look at individuals that are scoring in the yellow. But if more than your target are already in the good prospect, then you would only look at those. So it would depend on your needs. Looking at the sample group reports then, we can make it a bit bigger for you as well. It's very similar to your individual report. Again, it shows you what your good prospects are, your prospects, and your screened out. So from this report, you can see that for the sample report, there were no candidates that were totally screened out, that could not go further in the process. However, looking that out of 14, most of them are good prospects. You might, in this case, then say that those few individuals that were just prospects then be screened out. So in your group report, you will get a little graph or little table like that, indicating how your candidates have performed. This table should be interpreted the same way as your individual report, again only consulting your overall prospect scale. However, this should be consulted again in isolation without looking at any of your other scales. Those scales are just there to provide context as to how that overall prospect came about. The overall prospect scale summarizes the overall potential the candidate has for further assessment and selection and should be, again, the only scale consulted and to be used for pre-selection decisions. The table has been ranked according to the overall score from your highest to your lowest. So again, your good prospects will be on top, then your prospects, and if we had any screened out in this sample, they would have been at the bottom under candidate number 14. There is no other ranking within these three levels, so a candidate near the top of the good prospects cannot be said to be a better prospect to one near the bottom. As ranking is solely based on the overall score, there is no relationship to the order based on subscales or demographics. If further screening is necessary, the other scales of the prospect screener can be used to contextualize results within the job requirements, but these should not be interpreted independently as with the individual report. So that is how the prospect screener works. It's a very basic report, as you can see. So let's just go and look at some of the research done on this tool. Looking at the research, as I mentioned earlier, it is a JvR-developed assessment, so it does have South African norms. Our norm group is entry-level applicants. The constructs consist of verbal and numerical ability, detail orientation, emotional stability, and dependability. These have been shown to be most important for your entry-level white-collar positions. If we look at the psychometric properties of the prospect screener, reliability of Cronbach Alpha's internal consistency reliability was 0.71, which is acceptable for a screening tool such as this, given that with this tool alone, no decision-making will be made. It's just a screening tool. No significant performance differences or bias was seen between the genders, and construct validity was also determined by using Rationale, showing no item misfits. Moving on. So, the point of this webinar, why do we use the prospect screener in your high volume context? Well, firstly, it is cost effective. As of 2018, when this webinar has been made, the price of an individual prospect screener report is 70 Rand. If you put that into context of how expensive assessments are, I think that this is a very cost-effective tool to start off your selection process, as you can see which candidates you should be spending further time and energy on, and which are just not suitable for the role and should rather be screened out. It's time effective in the case that for candidates, they do not have to sit completing over 3 hours worth of assessments for a job that they have no chance of getting, while the prospect screener only takes 15 to 30 minutes to complete. So it's quick for the candidate to complete. They are likely not to be highly anxious while completing it, given it's not a very long test. It's very early in the process. For your recruiters again, to ask candidates to complete the short assessment saves them time from having to supervise longer assessment sessions, reading CVs, conducting interviews, or doing background checks on candidates that are clearly not suitable for the role. So using the prospect screener report, they can see which candidates they should consider, who needs further assessments, who they should screen out. This report also provides you with an overview of employability. The assessment report, as you can see, is very basic to interpret and allows recruiters to easily see which applicants are further worth pursuing. From your group report, you can also see your top candidates or your good prospects are the ones to further pursue, and the group report layout allows for easy comparison of your candidates. So some questions I've been asked about using this in high context is what is meant with high volume context and what makes it different from an individual context. A high volume context would indicate that you're generally using it on more than 5 or 6 candidates, that you have a huge pool, a huge talent pool that you would like to tap into and measure, and you can't necessarily afford or have the time, or it's not necessarily sensible to make all of your candidates go through this huge assessment battery. It's too expensive, it might be too time consuming, so you would use something like the prospect screener. Another question was, why would I want to use the prospect screener in high volume context instead of another assessment for high volume context? Well, the prospect screener has been developed in South Africa, firstly, and it is far cheaper than some of your other assessment methods. It's very quick to do and it's cost effective, so that is why you should be using it in your high volume context. How will the prospect screener help me to make decisions after assessing a big group of people? Well, if you use the prospect screener group report, that very nicely indicates to you your good prospects and who should be screened out. So I think that answers that question as to how it would help you with decisions with a large group of individuals. Lastly, so how would you use the prospect screener? What are your steps going forward after getting results with the prospect screener? Depending on the results, after looking at your good prospects, there are other assessments offered by JvR, such as the 16PF, which is a personality measure, all of our Hogan assessments, the risk, another personality assessment looking at your work-related personality and integrity, your competency assessment series, which is more competency and work-based, your EQI, and your BTI, Work Personality Index, and Matrigma. Your BTI, Work Personality Index, and Matrigma are also going to be following up webinars coming up later in the series, so please do look out for them to learn more about these assessments. And that is me, and hopefully everybody learns a little bit about the prospect screener. If there are any questions, please feel free to contact me. My email address is there, and further references is also there should you want to read up more about personality. And yeah, that's my story. Thanks, Gabi.
Thank you very much, Pakiza. I think this was very insightful, and I hope that the audience also enjoyed it and learned a little bit more about the prospect screener assessment. Thank you for tuning in. Goodbye, and we hope to also see you in the next Lunch and Learn webinar series. Goodbye.